The grand chandeliers of the Metropolitan Hotel cast their golden glow across the ballroom, illuminating the faces of New York's most influential families. Eleanor Ashford stood near the towering marble columns, her ivory silk gown catching the light like moonbeams captured in fabric. Her mother had orchestrated every detail of Eleanor's debut season with military precision, ensuring that her youngest daughter would marry well, preferably to one of the Vanderbilts or another family whose railroad wealth rivaled the Ashfords' own industrial empire. At 23 years old, Eleanor had endured 3 seasons of eligible bachelors, each more predictable than the last. They spoke of stock portfolios and hunting estates, their eyes reflecting nothing but ambition and calculation. Her father, Harrison Ashford, a steel magnate whose fortune had been built on the backs of thousands of workers, expected his daughter to secure a union that would further consolidate the family's power. Eleanor's older siblings had complied without question, but something in Eleanor's heart had always rebelled against such cold arithmetic. As she adjusted the pearl necklace at her throat, a gift from her grandmother that had graced 4 generations of Ashford women, Eleanor noticed a commotion near the main entrance. The orchestra had ceased its melody, and several dignified heads turned in unison. A man of considerable presence had arrived, his bearing regal despite the tailored evening coat that marked him as foreign to New York's fashion sensibilities. His dark hair caught the chandelier light, and when he turned to survey the room, Eleanor caught the penetrating intensity of his gaze. "That's the Duke of Ravenswood," whispered her companion, Miss Catherine Pemberton, clutching Eleanor's arm with the fervor of someone who had just witnessed the arrival of royalty. "English nobility. He's here on some business arrangement with the railroad magnates. Margaret said he refused 3 dinner invitations from the Astors themselves." Eleanor found herself unable to look away. There was something in his demeanor, a quiet authority mixed with an almost imperceptible weariness, that suggested a man carrying both privilege and burden. He wore his title the way other men wore their ambition, neither flaunting nor hiding it. The crowd parted naturally as he moved through the ballroom, society women fanning themselves with increased vigor. When their eyes finally met, Eleanor felt as though the entire ballroom had vanished. The Duke, she later learned his name was Adrian Blackthorne, Duke of Ravenswood, had been moving toward the refreshment table when he paused. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of surprise crossing his aristocratic features before being carefully schooled back into polite neutrality. He approached with measured steps. Eleanor's heart had begun a rhythm against her ribs that she could not entirely control. Her mother had coached her extensively on the proper way to acknowledge nobility, a specific angle of the head, a measured response, never too eager, never too aloof. But as Adrian stood before her, extending a hand that bore a signet ring of considerable antiquity, Eleanor found that all her mother's careful instruction seemed to dissolve like sugar in warm water. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice steadier than her hands, which she clasped before her to conceal their trembling. "I do not believe we have been introduced," Adrian replied, and his voice carried the cultured tones of Oxford education mixed with something warmer than Eleanor expected. "Though I confess, I have been observing you for the better part of an hour. You are the only person in this room who appears to be genuinely disinterested in my title." Eleanor felt the color rise to her cheeks. "I assure you, sir, I am quite interested in titles and all they represent. But as I find myself surrounded by such examples, perhaps my interest has become somewhat muted by repetition." A smile touched the corner of his mouth, the first genuine expression she had witnessed cross his face. "A forthright woman. How refreshingly uncommon. I wonder if your candor extends to accepting a dance with a foreign duke, or if you are already committed to one of the eager gentlemen hovering at the edges of your vision." It was the most dangerous thing Eleanor could have done. It was also the only thing she wanted to do. The orchestra struck up a Viennese waltz as Adrian led her to the center of the ballroom. As they moved through the dance, Eleanor became acutely aware of the sudden and profound shift in the room's atmosphere. She could feel the weight of 100 gazes upon them, speculation, shock, and in some quarters, unmistakable disapproval. Her mother's face, visible above the crowd for a moment, had gone pale. But in Adrian's arms, with his hands secure against her waist and his dark eyes holding hers, Eleanor found that she did not care. For the first time she understood why people spoke of love and destiny in the same breath. As they turned through the final measures of the waltz, Adrian leaned slightly closer, and his voice became a vibration she felt through her entire being. "I suspect," he whispered, "that you are about to cause me considerable complication." Eleanor's breath caught. "I fear you are correct, Your Grace, though I wonder who shall be most complicated." When the dance ended and Adrian returned her to her mother's side, the consequences of that single waltz had already begun to crystallize. Her mother's lips had compressed into a thin line of fury. The Vanderbilt contingent regarded her with unveiled hostility. But Eleanor understood in that moment that Adrian had been transformed from a distant curiosity into something far more dangerous. He had become the measure against which all other possibilities would be weighed and found wanting. The morning edition of the Society pages arrived with Eleanor's breakfast tray, and with it came the first whisper of the storm that would come to define her life. Beneath a headline proclaiming "English Duke cuts a striking figure at Metropolitan Ball," the article's author had taken considerable liberty in detailing Eleanor's dance with Adrian, describing it with language that bordered on scandalous in its romantic undertones. Her father read the piece while Eleanor watched from the doorway of his study, her stomach tied in knots. Harrison Ashford was a man who prided himself on order, on the careful management of his public image and his family's reputation. He had built his empire through ruthless efficiency and an almost pathological attention to detail. When he lowered the newspaper and fixed Eleanor with a gaze cold enough to freeze champagne, she understood that she had unwittingly ignited something far more volatile than mere social gossip. "Explain yourself," he commanded, gesturing for her to enter and close the door. Eleanor's mother stood near the window, her hand pressed against her throat, her expression a complex mixture of shame and fury. "There is nothing to explain, Father. I was introduced to the Duke of Ravenswood at the ball. We danced once. It is a perfectly standard occurrence at such events." Her father rose from his chair with the deliberate slowness of a man marshalling considerable emotion. "You do not understand the implications, Eleanor. That man is not here for pleasant socializing. He represents interests that are directly contrary to ours. His family's investments in the railroads put them in competition with our own ventures. And now, because you have been seen dancing with him, the entire city is already speculating about whether his presence in New York has something to do with you." That is ridiculous," Eleanor replied, though even as she spoke, she knew that her father was not entirely wrong. The morning's post had brought 3 requests for her hand in marriage from gentlemen who had never previously shown the slightest interest. Her own social currency had somehow increased exponentially, and she understood that this was precisely because the mystery of the Duke's attention had elevated her status. "It is ridiculous to the point of being dangerous," her mother interjected, her voice sharp with anxiety. "Do you have any conception of what this could mean for your sister's prospects, for the entire family's standing? The Rothschilds have already begun distancing themselves from us." Eleanor felt a pang of guilt at this revelation. Her older sister Margaret had a pending engagement to a member of the Rothschild family, an arrangement that had been carefully orchestrated over 2 years. The possibility that Eleanor's actions might jeopardize Margaret's future was a sobering one. "I will simply avoid the Duke in the future," Eleanor offered, though even as she spoke the words, she felt as though she were extracting something vital from her own chest. It was merely a dance. Her father made a sound that was part laugh, part growl. It was merely a dance that has now become the subject of speculation in every drawing room from here to Philadelphia. And the Duke, to judge from the letters I have received today from my associates, appears to be quite deliberately positioning himself to repeat that dance at the Vanderbilt's gala this week. Eleanor's heart leapt, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. How could you possibly know his intentions? Because men like Adrian Blackthorne do not do anything without calculation, her father replied coldly. He has made you a target, whether for romantic reasons or for some business advantage, I have yet to determine. But I will make this absolutely clear, Eleanor. You will not dance with him at the Vanderbilt Gala. You will not speak to him. You will conduct yourself with such perfect propriety that no one could possibly connect you to his name. And if you disobey me in this, you will discover that I can make your position in this family and in this society untenable. The threat hung in the air like a blade suspended over a flame. Eleanor understood that her father was not being melodramatic. He had the power to follow through on his words. An unmarried daughter who defied her father's explicit instructions could find herself cast out, sent to live with distant relatives or worse, married off to some lesser gentleman as punishment for her disobedience. Over the next 3 days, Eleanor found herself confined in a manner that was technically not imprisonment, but which felt suffocatingly close to it. She was not allowed to accept social calls, was kept from the park, where she might accidentally encounter the Duke, and found herself the subject of increasingly strained conversations with her mother, who alternated between threats and pleading. Margaret appeared in Eleanor's room the evening before the Vanderbilt Gala, her earlier disapproval having softened into something more nuanced. "The Rothschilds have sent a letter," she said carefully. "They have expressed their confidence that the recent rumors are without foundation and that our family's integrity remains unquestioned." "That is excellent news," Eleanor replied, though she detected the carefully hidden barb beneath her sister's words. "It is, because I spoke to them personally," Margaret continued. "I explained that you are a sensible girl who was momentarily enchanted by a title, but that you are quite firmly back within the pale of propriety. However, Eleanor, if you continue to cultivate this connection with the Duke, I fear that even the Rothschilds' generosity will have limits." Eleanor looked at her sister, this woman who had always followed the rules, who had invested her own future in the careful calculations their society demanded. "Margaret, do you ever wonder what it would be like to make your own choices?" Her sister's expression grew sad. "Every day," she admitted quietly. "But I have also learned that choices come with consequences. I had to determine which consequences I could live with and which would destroy me. I chose stability for myself and for my family. You must make that same calculation." That night, Eleanor did not sleep. Instead, she stood at her window and looked out over the darkened streets of Manhattan, wondering if Adrian was somewhere in the city and whether he was thinking of her. She wondered what would happen if she simply walked away from the expectation, from the pressure, from the careful architecture of her life. She wondered if love could possibly justify such devastation. The answer, she knew, would be determined at the Vanderbilt Gala. The Vanderbilt mansion blazed with light, every window glowing with the brilliance of 1,000 candles. Eleanor had been dressed by her mother and her mother's lady's maid with a precision that suggested she was being prepared for battle. Her gown, a midnight blue silk with silver embroidery, was designed to draw attention while projecting an aura of untouchable perfection. Not a single curl had been left to chance. She was the picture of a woman firmly back within society's boundaries. Her father had given her explicit instructions. She was to dance exactly 3 times, once with Lord Worthington, once with the Vanderbilt heir, and once with a cousin she barely knew. She was to speak to no one else of consequence. She was to retire early, claiming fatigue. She was to give no opening whatsoever for interpretation or scandal. Eleanor had promised compliance, and she meant it. right up until the moment Adrian appeared in the ballroom and everything else ceased to exist. He wore evening dress with the ease of a man for whom such garments were simply the natural extension of his position. But it was his eyes that arrested her. They found her immediately in the crowd, with an intensity that felt almost physical. Eleanor watched as he engaged in a conversation with a cluster of railroad magnates, her father among them. She saw him glance in her direction once, twice, a third time. The orchestra began a quadrille. Eleanor danced with Lord Worthington, who spent the duration of the dance discussing his prize horse with the solemnity of a man discussing matters of national import. When the dance ended, she made her way toward the refreshment table, keeping to the edges of the room as she had been instructed. "Miss Ashford." His voice came from behind her, and Eleanor's body responded before her mind could marshal any defense. She turned to find Adrian standing with two gentlemen, whom he politely excused before turning his full attention to her. "Your Grace," she responded, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "I trust you are enjoying your time in New York?" "I was not," he replied, his eyes searching her face. "Until recently, but I find that circumstances have improved considerably. Would you do me the profound honor of dancing with me?" Eleanor was acutely aware of the eyes upon them. She could see her father pausing mid-conversation across the room, his body stiffening as he took in the scene. She could see her mother clasping her fan with white-knuckled intensity. She understood, with perfect clarity, that accepting Adrian's request meant choosing to defy her father. It meant choosing consequences. "I cannot," she said quietly. "It would cause considerable distress to my family." "And that disturbs you?" Adrian asked. Something flickered across his face, hurt, perhaps, or disappointment. "Immensely," Eleanor admitted, "but not enough to make me refuse." She placed her gloved hand in his, and together they moved to the dance floor as the orchestra began a waltz. This time there was no carefully maintained distance, no pretense of mere social interaction. Adrian held her as though she were made of something precious and potentially fragile, and as they moved through the measures of the dance, he spoke in low tones meant for her alone. "I did not intend to cause this disruption to your life," he said. "When I first came to New York, you were merely a striking woman at a ball. But after that first dance, Eleanor, you became something impossible to ignore. I have spent the past 3 days in torture, knowing that I was the source of your family's displeasure, and yet unable to convince myself that it was my duty to simply leave." "You should leave," Eleanor replied, though her hand tightened against his shoulder. "You should go back to England and forget about me entirely. My family will never accept you. The scandal will damage both our families. Everything about this is senseless." "On the contrary," Adrian replied, "it is the most sensible thing I have ever felt. Eleanor, I am prepared to offer you something that has nothing to do with business arrangements or social positioning. I am prepared to offer you myself. If you will have me, I will fight for you against every obstacle this city can present, but you must be willing to fight as well." Eleanor saw her father abandoning his conversation entirely, moving with clear purpose toward them. She understood that this was her moment of decision. She could end the dance, apologize profusely, explain to Adrian that she was simply a woman raised to understand her obligations. She could preserve her family's reputation and her place within society. Or she could leap into the abyss with him. The music swelled around them as Adrian slowed their dance, bringing them to a temporary halt near the orchestra. "I love you, Eleanor Ashford," he said, his voice carrying a certainty that seemed to span centuries. "I loved you from the moment I first looked into your eyes. I will love you when we face the consequences of this moment. And if you love me in return, we will find a way to overcome every obstacle." Her father had reached them now, his face flushed with anger. Her mother was not far behind. The entire ballroom had fallen silent, and Eleanor understood that every word of their next exchange would be scrutinized and analyzed for weeks. "I love you," Eleanor said, her voice clear enough to carry to those nearest them. "And I choose you." Her father's hand came out to seize her arm, and in that moment something inside Eleanor shifted irrevocably. The girl who had been raised to obey, to comply, to accept the careful architecture of her life, that girl ceased to exist. In her place stood a woman capable of extraordinary courage. The weeks that followed the Vanderbilt Gala were the most difficult of Eleanor's life, and simultaneously the most clarifying. Her father had made good on his threat to make her position untenable. She had been removed from the family home and sent to stay with her Aunt Elizabeth, a woman whose own marriage had once scandalized society, and who maintained a polite but distant relationship with the rest of the Ashford family. The drawing rooms of New York had erupted into gossip of unprecedented proportions. Some society matrons whispered with scandalized delight, others with genuine disapproval. The newspapers had a field day, the Duke's attendance at various social events, his increasingly frequent meetings with Eleanor, his clear intention to make his feelings public and permanent, were all documented with breathless speculation. But what surprised Eleanor most was that the sky did not fall. Life continued. The trains still ran on time, fortunes were still made and lost, and society evolved as it always did to accommodate new realities. Margaret came to visit her at Aunt Elizabeth's residence on a grey November afternoon, bringing with her news from the larger Ashford world. "The Rothschilds remain committed to my engagement," she reported, though her expression was more complex than her words suggested. "Father has accepted a series of business dealings with several of the Duke's associates. There is talk that the two families might actually find mutual benefit in various investment opportunities." Eleanor could not help but smile at this revelation. "So Father has determined how to transform a scandal into a business advantage? Father has learned, as he always does, how to make the best of circumstances that have moved beyond his control," Margaret corrected gently. "He is not pleased with you, Eleanor, but he is not prepared to sacrifice economic advantage simply to maintain a grudge." "And Mother?" Eleanor asked, though she was not certain she wanted to hear the answer. "Mother has been consulting with various friends about how to manage your upcoming engagement ball in a manner that will allow society to adjust to the idea of your union without appearing to condone your behavior," Margaret replied. "She has already begun planning the wedding breakfast. I believe she is attempting to transform scandal into triumph through the sheer force of her will and her ability to organize a social event." Eleanor thought about this for a moment. "That sounds rather like Mother." "It is exactly like Mother," Margaret confirmed. "And perhaps it will serve a greater good. You have become quite famous, you know. Every unmarried woman in this city is now inspired by your ability to choose your own path. And every unmarried woman's mother is correspondingly horrified by the precedent you have set. I suspect that in 20 years' time, your defiance will have helped change things significantly for our daughters, if not for ourselves." After Margaret departed, Eleanor sat in the parlour of her aunt's house and reflected on how rapidly and thoroughly her life had been transformed. She had lost her family's immediate approval, her place in the society she had been raised to navigate, her certainty about her future, and yet, in losing all these things, she had gained something that she suspected would prove far more valuable: the knowledge that she was capable of extraordinary courage. Adrian called that evening, as he had each evening since she had moved to her aunt's residence. He no longer asked for permission or wondered about propriety. He simply arrived at the appointed hour and spent time with the woman he loved, courting her with a devotion that was becoming increasingly public. "Your father has agreed to meet with me," Adrian informed her as they sat in the drawing room with her aunt, who had proven to be a surprisingly liberal chaperone. "He has certain conditions, of course, but the conversation suggests that opposition is no longer inevitable. Father is attempting to transform scandal into advantage," Eleanor explained, relaying her conversation with Margaret. Adrian smiled at this assessment. That is precisely what I expected. It is why I approach my own family not as a source of opposition to your father, but as a potential source of profit, Adrian replied. I have found, in my dealings with American society, that sentiment often yields to fiscal incentive. That is cynical, Eleanor observed. That is practical, Adrian corrected, and I have learned that in order to build a life with you, I will need to make use of every tool available. Your family's opposition is formidable, Eleanor, but it is not insurmountable if properly managed. Eleanor found herself looking at him. This man who had emerged from society's highest echelons and yet who was willing to navigate its most treacherous depths to build a future with her. I wonder if I have created a monster, she mused. If you have, Adrian replied, taking her hand gently, then I am a monster who loves you entirely and completely, and who will continue to love you when all of this has faded into the background of our lives. The engagement was announced in January, and the announcement created hardly any stir at all. The wedding was planned for spring to be held in the cathedral in New York, with the Vanderbilts and the Astors in attendance. Eleanor's mother had already begun the process of wedding planning with such enthusiasm that it almost seemed as though she had engineered the entire sequence of events herself. And perhaps, Eleanor thought, that was exactly what her mother believed. In the months between the announcement and the wedding, Eleanor received letters from women across the city, unmarried women, married women, widowed women, all expressing gratitude for her courage in choosing love over obligation. She realized that her choice had meant something far beyond her own life. In defying her family, in standing beside Adrian despite the scandal, she had demonstrated that a woman had the power to determine her own destiny. On her wedding day, as she stood in the cathedral with Adrian's hand secure around her own, Eleanor understood that she had not truly chosen between her family and her love. She had chosen something far more profound. She had chosen herself. And in doing so, she had inadvertently chosen a path that would allow countless other women to do the same. The ceremony was beautiful, the reception lavish, the social implications significant. But what Eleanor would remember most was the moment after they had been declared married, when Adrian bent to kiss her, and she felt the absolute rightness of being exactly where she belonged, not in society's approval, but in the arms of the man who had loved her enough to face down the fury of an entire social order.